This series contains adult language and depictions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised. Yes, I know. The Olympics have come to an end. On to the Paralympic Games, and then an excruciating 18 months or so until the games of the 25th Winter Olympiad in Italy. As I'm sure you're aware, there were just too many highlights and heartbreaks to count, and further, this isn't a sports podcast, so I'll just say it was an incredible 16 days, and I'm thrilled to see my DVR filling up with Paralympic broadcasts now. And, as if we need any further evidence, Tom Cruise is the greatest movie star of all time. So, in honor of the next Olympic Games in February of 2026 in northern Italy, I've got a story for you from that future host country, very near one of the host cities, the swanky, cosmopolitan hub of fashion and influence, Milan. It's the story of a father's fight for justice and his willingness to stare into the terrifying abyss of what amounted to militant Satanists. I admit that occasionally I assume the role of a doubting Thomas when it comes to some of these stories. However, other times, they're disturbingly true. This is one of those times. Welcome back to The Devil Within. You're listening to The Beasts of Satan. Somma Lombardo is a town tucked into the Lombardy region in the Varese province of northern Italy. It sits on what's known as the Lombardy Plain in the foothills of the Alps, very near the border with Switzerland. The region is known for its majestic lakes that have been the playgrounds of the rich and famous for centuries, Lake Como and Lake Maggiore among the most famous. The town of Somma Lombardo popped up along an important Roman road that connected Lake Maggiore to the bustling city of Milan more than 2,000 years ago. The area is steeped in history, so much so that if you happen to take a stroll through the forests that surround the town, you'll most likely happen upon trenches and airstrips from World War II. But once Somma Lombardo earned its city charter in 1959, it's grown into, if not a major city, a town of respectable size and stature, surrounded by the endless forests that stretch all the way to the Alps. And today it's less than an hour's drive from Milan. Although we'll be covering a series of horrific crimes, as stated, this is actually a story about a father's promise to bring to justice those who did unspeakable things to his child. And for a time, they got away with it. It's a story of perseverance and courage surviving in the long shadow of evil. In January of 1998, Fabio Tallis was a 16-year-old heavy metal musician living with his parents in that bustling metropolis of Milan. He was also a student, but if we're being honest here, his studies came in a distant third place in his rankings of what was important to him. First was his music, always his music. A close second was his 19-year-old girlfriend, Chiara Marino. So let's get right to the point on a major issue here. There's going to be a lot of talk about heavy metal music and speed metal music. Both genres have been accused of pushing satanic teachings or glorifying Satanism in the past. And the people hurling those accusations, they're not wrong. But that doesn't mean the music is responsible for the actions people take. I loved NWA in high school and still do, but I didn't become a cop killer when I moved to Los Angeles. I think I've used an argument similar before that despite all the fear-mongering, I don't think anyone burned their house down because Beavis and Butthead told them to do it. Popular media, though powerful when it comes to fashion and music and even politics, the body of evidence just hasn't emerged that provides definitive links between aggressive music triggering violence in its listeners. There is some evidence that prolonged exposure to that type of music can lead to desensitization when it comes to violence, but not causing one to commit violence. And when it comes to so-called satanic music inspiring violence in the name of Satan, there's even less of a concrete connection. But there are exceptions. There was a band in the 90s from Milan called the Beasts of Satan. They specialized in what's been alternatively called death metal or black metal. Those types of music are known for fast, pounding beats, screeching lyrics, and flamboyant, over-the-top performances given by band members often made up to look like corpses. The Beasts of Satan were often the headliner at a music club called the Midnight Pub. The Midnight Pub was the center of the hardcore music scene in Milan and the surrounding area, and Fabio Talas, along with his girlfriend Chiara Marino, were regulars at the bar and in the audience, and even sometimes on stage with the band. But wait, you ask, this kid's only 16. I mean, I know Europe is progressive, but that's taking it a little too far. Well, young Fabio was 6'2" and 220 pounds, so it was relatively easy for him to pass off as old enough to be in a bar. And also his girlfriend was 19, which is old enough to drink in Italy, so the two of them together, they didn't have any issues. And it turns out this young couple not only loved the band, the Beasts of Satan, they were also very friendly with them. What the young couple didn't know was just how seriously the band members of the Beasts of Satan were taking themselves, their music, and their allegiance to the so-called Dark Lord. But you know what? Even if they did know how fucking bonkers these people were, I doubt there was any way they could have figured out what the band had in store for Chiara. 3 men from the band, Andrea Volpi, Nicola Saponi, and Mario Macchioni, had reached the truly insane decision that Chiara bore a striking resemblance to the Virgin Mary, as if anyone really knows what she looked like. And because of this, she needed to be sacrificed to Satan. We're not really sure exactly how things went down, but the night took its first dark turn when Fabio Talas' father received a strange phone call from his son. Fabio told his dad that instead of coming home that night, he was going to stay at his girlfriend's place. Now, this was highly unusual. Remember, Fabio was 16. No matter how old he looked, he was still a minor and wasn't in the habit of telling his father where he was going to be spending the night. He had a curfew. He was in school. He was in high school. So yeah, his pops knew something was rotten in Denmark. So he called the club right back and asked the bartender to find his son. He was easy to spot, but he was too late. Under some unknown pretense, the boys from the Beasts of Satan had kidnapped Fabio Talas and Chiara Harris and were making the drive in the official Beasts of Satan fucking touring van less than an hour to the northwest into the vast forests of Lombardy. Once arrived in those deep woods of northern Italy, the members of the band engaged in a satanic ritual that involved alcohol, drugs, and, their own music. And then Chiara was attacked, ritually beaten, and stabbed to death. All because it was believed she resembled a woman who allegedly lived more than 2,000 years prior. Fabio, of course, did everything within his power to defend Chiara from these fiends, but he was overpowered by their greater number and was ultimately buried in a large grave right beside her. When Fabio failed to return home that night or the next day, his father knew his instincts from the previous night had been correct. But the police kept hitting dead ends. There were no eyewitnesses who saw Fabio and Chiara leave the Midnight Pub, and no one had any idea what happened to them or had any contact with them since the night they disappeared. But Fabio's dad, a man named Michele Talas, wasn't about to give up. Michele, no doubt familiar with the so-called Satanic Panic that had gained national attention in the United States over the previous decade, he was convinced that whatever harm befell his son was in some way connected to Satanism, most likely through the music his son so adored. For 6 long years, Michele Talas immersed himself in the lifestyle his son had adopted, going to clubs, following the major death metal bands of the time, including the Beasts of Satan, and slowly he zeroed in on who and what he believed was responsible for his son's disappearance. Fabio had in fact played with several of the bands in Milan, not as a full member, but more as a hired gun when needed. As stated earlier, he had often been asked to join the Beasts of Satan, but not on the night he disappeared, although the band did play at the Midnight Pub that night. Turns out Fabio and Chiara were only present as fans and as friends to have a beer with after the show. Then, in January of 2004, almost 6 years to the day after Fabio and Chiara went missing, 27-year-old Mariangela Pezzata was murdered in a town neighboring Somma Lombardo. Michele Tallis heard of this and started making some connections. He figured out that Mariangela was the ex-girlfriend of Beasts of Satan band member Andrea Volpe. Michele presented his findings to the police and urged them to investigate the band and look for a connection between the murder of Mariangela Pezzata and the disappearance and likely murder of his son and his son's girlfriend. The police took him seriously, as Mr. Tallis had amassed an impressive file filled with pertinent information, timelines, and persons of interest. But, as often happens, the stupidity of criminals is what delivers them to justice. So this Volpe monster had decided that his ex-girlfriend, Mariangela, knew too much about his satanic sect, and especially knew too much about his involvement in the murders of Fabio and Chiara. So he, obviously, planned her murder. It was simple. Invite her over to his place to dinner to have a friendly catch-up session, but instead, murder her. He'd have his 18-year-old runaway cocaine addict girlfriend hiding in the back room to help him, just in case. Volpe shot Mariangela, then, instead of involving his girlfriend, he called up a bandmate, Nicola Sapone, to help him bury the body in the greenhouse of his teenage girlfriend's parents' house. Okay, so then Sapone left, and Volpe and his girlfriend did a bunch of cocaine, washed it down with some heroin, and made the awesome decision to get rid of the victim's car by driving it into a river where it would never be found. That could maybe work, but instead, he crashed the car into a tree on the way and got them both arrested. Very quickly, it all came crashing down for the Beasts of Satan. Volpe, hoping for leniency, confessed right away, not only to the murder of Mariangela Pezzata, but to the killings of both Fabio Tallis and Chiara Marino. He gave up other members of the band who were accomplices, and Mario Macchione confessed to beating Fabio to death with a hammer, and Volpe and Sapone confessed to stabbing Chiara to death. It was Volpe himself who led investigators to the secluded grave deep in the forests of Lombardy. Given the heinous nature of the crimes, at the conclusion of the 2005 trial, the judge imposed a sentence even greater than the prosecution was asking for, 30 years for Volpe. But an additional trial in 2006 put the entire band on trial, and sentences of 27 years for those with less involvement to life without parole for those who actually got their hands dirty were handed down. And justice, it was believed, was finally delivered for the victims of the Beasts of Satan. Thanks for listening. Be sure you're following The Devil Within wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. You could also check out our socials at The Devil Within Pod on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Until next time, stay safe out there. The Devil Within, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. Written and produced by Brandon Morgan. Our post-production supervisor is Bruce Whitkin, who also provided original music for this episode. For The Devil Within, I'm your host, Brandon Morgan.